Ukraine has launched American Atacms missiles at Vladimir Putin's prized Kerch Bridge as Kyiv appears to be winning the argument over using US weapons to hit sovereign Russian soil.
Kyiv again, and this is the scene of yet. We're in Kyiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with those strikes over the Sea of Azov and at Vladimir Putin's prized Kerch Bridge, the bridge that links occupied Crimea to sovereign Russian territory. Russian news agencies reported overnight that their air defences shot down what they said was a volley of 8 Atacms missiles over the Sea of Azov, as well as Ukrainian drones targeting the bridge. Now, this would be significant because these are some of the newest missiles given from America to Ukraine. Long-range precision missiles which Kyiv had been asking for a long time. The footage of those strikes so far not especially definitive. It's glowing dots in a dark sky, but nonetheless we understand, we've been led to believe that these are the strikes against that bridge, and it comes at the same time as Ukraine's GUR military intelligence service has released footage of another strike against Russian assets in Crimea, this time against patrol ships. The Group 13 of Ukraine's military intelligence using their Mogura V5 drones, and those drones capturing extraordinary footage again of Russian helicopters patrolling in the sky above them, trying to shoot them out of the water as they approach their targets. Indeed, there's also what appears to be drone footage showing those Russian helicopters patrolling over the Black Sea, trying to shoot those Mogura sea drones. Now that's significant because that shows us that Ukraine appears to have a surveillance capability of keeping a drone in the sky with eyes on those drones, the sea drones, eyes on the Russian helicopters as an attack is unfolded, presumably undetected by Russia, at least the surveillance drone undetected by Russia, because there's no attempt either to interfere, to block its transmissions, or indeed to shoot it down. So 2 attacks on Crimea, one on the eastern tip, one by those sea drones on the western tip. The one on the eastern tip, the one on Kerch or around Kerch, more significant potentially because of the use of those American weapons. And that brings us to, once again, the real topic of debate, and that is the continuing argument over the use of Western weapons, and particularly American weapons, to hit targets inside Russia. Now, we'll just recap where we are. The United Kingdom was out on the front foot on this some weeks ago, with Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron insisting Ukraine absolutely has the right to use Western weapons to hit targets in Russian soil. Britain's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps said it would be absurd to try and tell Ukraine that it cannot use those weapons to defend itself by hitting military targets inside Russia. Since then, we've also heard from French President Emmanuel Macron echoing that sentiment, that you can't give weapons to Ukraine but then tell it that it cannot use those weapons to defend itself. And we've also heard from Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen saying very similar things, that these weapons are for Ukraine to defend themselves. It's interesting, the response that we've seen from Russia, that gives us an indication of how worried they are, the idea that actually this could make a difference. First of all, we saw the British ambassador summoned to Moscow. Subsequently, we saw Moscow announcing non-strategic or rather tactical nuclear weapons drills, rehearsals. More recently, we've heard from the Russian ambassador to Copenhagen in Denmark, suggesting that were Denmark to allow its missiles or its weapons to be used to strike those targets in Russia, it would have devastating consequences. He said the conflict would spiral out of control. And that Russian ambassador also singled out Denmark's promise to provide Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. He pointed out, the Russian ambassador, that those F-16s are capable of carrying nuclear weapons, and he said Russia would see the arrival of those aircraft as a potentially nuclear threat. Now, we've heard a lot of Russian saber-rattling over this, but it does give us an indication of how Moscow is feeling. They appear to be feeling nervous that these weapons could make a significant difference on the battlefield, and all of their posturing over the last few weeks has been to try and deter NATO and Ukraine's allies from making those authorizations. Now, we understand that many allies have already tacitly given Ukraine permission for those strikes on Russian soil. But of course, the game changer in this equation is going to be the United States. And thus far, Washington has maintained a discreet ban on using its weapons to hit targets on Russian soil. That appears to be changing, and I'm going to cite two examples. The first is a report in the New York Times which says President Joe Biden appears to be edging ever closer towards giving Ukraine that authorization. Indeed, his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, saying that America has adapted its policies as the requirements of the war have evolved over the last 2+ years. So both of those signals suggesting the American position could be about to change. And of course, that comes as there is a meeting of NATO defense ministers as we speak. The other development in the US press comes in the Washington Post, and this is a report elucidating some of the US concerns. And I think for the first time we've heard a specific reason why America is concerned that these strikes on Russia might trigger an escalation. US officials, unnamed US officials, have said they're particularly concerned about Ukraine's strikes, deep strikes in Russian soil against Russia's long-range strategic surveillance radars. These are over-the-horizon early warning systems. Now, Ukraine has maintained that these strikes are attempts to degrade the Russian radars which it is using to support its invasion of Ukraine. American officials are concerned that actually these are strategic early warning systems. These are the early warning systems that Russia uses to detect a potential nuclear strike by America or other nuclear powers in the world. And if these early warning systems are degraded or destroyed, then clearly that is going to leave Moscow feeling vulnerable to the threat of a doomsday nuclear attack. Now, there's no suggestion that that doomsday nuclear attack is coming, but it is an insight into why Moscow would see these attacks as potentially such an escalation. Now, I know from your comments that many of you find it outrageous that on the one hand, Russia continues to use weapons from Iran, North Korea, dual-use parts from China to prosecute its bloodbath war in Ukraine, while at the same time saying it would be an escalation for Ukraine to use Western weapons against targets in Russian soil. And I have to say I'm minded to agree with you on that principle. This report in the Washington Post is perhaps the first coherent argument I've seen of why certain targets inside Russia might be off limits, or at least of more concern to policymakers in Washington. So far, what we've seen is Ukraine hitting a range of targets in Russia, including those early warning systems. One of them, the most recent one, some 1,100 miles inside Russian territory. It gives you an idea of what Ukraine is managing to achieve. We understand with its own sovereign capabilities, its own homemade drones. But we know Ukraine has also hit railway lines. It's also hit airfields. And most recently, it's been targeting Russia's oil refineries, trying to degrade that ability for Russia to sustain both its economy and to sustain its soldiers on the front lines across Ukraine. Final thing I want to mention before we get on to questions, just for a bit of a change of pace, is reports that potentially thousands of dolphins, whales and cetaceans have been killed in the Black Sea. Now, this comes from wildlife national parks officials in Ukraine. Suggestions that dozens of dolphins and whales have washed up on beaches, particularly in and around the eastern Black Sea, as a result of the sonars, the underwater detection systems, the noises being pumped into the sea by both sides in the conflict to detect each other's vessels. Whilst relatively small numbers have been washing up, officials suggesting that's probably only about 5% of the total number that have been affected. So just a small reminder of the impact that this conflict is having, not just, of course, the devastating human impact, but also the impact on the natural environment as well. On to questions. If you do have any, please ask them in the comments below. First question is suggestions that Vladimir Putin would accept a peace deal if Ukraine were to cede all the territory it has currently lost. Would that be a realistic scenario? Well, the first thing to say is that any peace deal the West has maintained and Ukraine's allies have maintained would have to be on Ukraine's terms. It doesn't seem feasible at the moment that President Zelensky could feasibly reach a deal on those terms, ceding all of that territory, as it would not be politically acceptable inside Ukraine. And even if it were, and even if Ukraine were to cede some territory in exchange for a lasting peace, the crucial thing would be what guarantees would it have that it isn't simply giving Russia breathing space to rebuild its armed forces and then launch another invasion down the line. Of course, we just need to look back to 2014 because that's basically what happened. Moscow annexed Crimea. It effectively supported these uprisings in the eastern Donbass and partially annexed that territory, although not totally officially, waited another 8 years and then launched this full-scale invasion that we're seeing now. So it would all depend on what guarantees any such peace deal came with. Question number 2. Do I think that the Chinese drills around Taiwan were linked to Vladimir Putin's visit and indeed linked to what Russia has been doing on the ground in Ukraine? Now, certainly those drills, those massive Chinese drills around Taiwan, effectively encircling the island of Taiwan, did broadly coincide with Russia launching its offensive in northeastern Kyiv in Ukraine. China has said that its drills were in fact a response to comments by Taiwan's leader sort of reasserting Taiwan's independence. China regularly carries out these sorts of large-scale drills. Hard to say conclusively whether or not they were linked, but clearly, from the West's point of view, having a hot war raging on Europe's doorstep makes the possibility of a second conflict in the Pacific far more challenging because the West, were it to go to Taiwan's aid, were America to go to Taiwan's aid, would find itself more stretched. And finally, a question about the reports that actually came out about a month ago that America had allegedly bought 81 Soviet-era jets from Kazakhstan. It's worth pointing out, these reports emerged in a Ukrainian newspaper, the Kyiv Post, and the planes that were allegedly bought through proxies and third parties but funded by America were a variety of Sukhoi and MiG fighters and bombers, aging aircraft, none of which we understand were serviceable. These reports are unconfirmed, but were that to have been the case, were America to have done this, question would be why these planes can't be used. 2 reasons it would seem. One is for spare parts, to take them to perhaps to get the parts to keep Ukraine's air force flying. The second reason would be to remove them from circulation to avoid Russia getting its hands on these aircrafts. As I said, those reports are unconfirmed, but those would appear to me to be the 2 most sensible reasons for buying those aircraft. As ever, if you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below. We're really grateful. We get a fantastic response from you on YouTube in the comments, and we will endeavour to answer some of